Hello and welcome to Women Lit Unbound. I'm Sherilyn Parsons, founder and executive director of the Bay Area Book Festival and Women Lit. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Louise Aronson, professor of medicine at UCSF, Pulitzer finalist, and author of A History of the Present Illness and Elderhood, and our moderator, the inimitable Jeneé Darden, award-winning journalist, author, and KALW host of Sights and Sounds. Welcome, Louise and Jeneé.
Hello. Hello. Thank you so much for that welcome. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Jeneé Darden. I will be your moderator for this awesome discussion with Dr. Louise Aronson. And like Sherilyn said, at the end of this talk, we'll have the chance to answer a few of your questions. At any time during this program, if you have a question, just type it into the chat box, which is located at the bottom bar of your screen, and we'll select a few for Louise to answer. So, hello, Louise.
Hello, Jeneé. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. We made it to this day. I'm so excited. I was looking forward to this day and to talk to you about something that I like talking about and that you clearly like talking about, which is aging.
Yes, I love talking about it, which most people consider strange, but I'm good with it.
You know. I agree. Most people do consider it strange, but I think it's a fascinating topic. I think it's a complex topic, and I think it's a beautiful topic. First of all, before we even get to that, congratulations on being a Pulitzer finalist.
Thank you. It was
That's
very
awesome.
exciting and totally unexpected.
So did the envelope float to your door in gold with wings and like?
Yeah, it wasn't like that. Maybe if you want that happens, but I was actually at work, so I just found out by texts and emails.
Oh wow! What was going through your mind when you found out?
Well, first it was strange congratulations, and then I did see the word Pulitzer or Pulitzer. I'm always pronouncing it incorrectly. And I was like, no, that's ridiculous. And so then I was actually seeing patients. So I had a few minutes, a patient wasn't getting on. So I'm on my phone, I'm looking around, and then sure enough. And then I was literally sort of tremulous with excitement, but I had to see my next patient. So I did that. And then actually the one after that canceled because people have trouble with video. And that was when I got to properly celebrate. And then I had to go back to clinic after that, which was a little, maybe not my finest performance as a physician, but I think I did okay.
Well, congratulations. I'm from the Bay Area, so to see here like a Bay Area native one, that's really exciting. But let's get to the book. So Elderhood, which I have. Ta-da! This awesome book. Okay, the term elderhood, because there's so many terms to talk about older adults, you know.
Right.
Why elderhood?
Well, the whole point was it's a phase of life just like childhood and adulthood. And if you don't have terminology for something, if you don't have proper terminology, then you don't have programs and policies and respect and everything else you need to have success in life. So, we have this extensive language for childhood and actually less language for adulthood. And then we sort of have a poverty of language for adulthood, for elderhood. So it's interesting, like with kids, you change a ton between birth and 20, and we have a lot of language for that. You've got neonate, infant, toddler, kid, tween, teen, young adult, right? And it's been all of 20 years. But legally, we become elders at age 65, and the oldest patient I ever had was 111. The oldest person in the US right now is 114. Now, those are exceptional, but there are a ton of centenarians. So that means elderhood lasts twice as long as childhood for a decent number of people. Mm-hmm. And we do have a lot of words, but nobody actually likes any of them, and that's about prejudice. So the other intent I had was to just kind of cool down the language. Like, this is just a life stage. It's like the other ones, not a big deal. Child, adult, elder, that's just life, and it is far better than dying young.
And I know you talked about in your book, or you wrote about an experiment that I guess another scholar did as far as looking at language. And it seemed like when they asked, what comes to mind with old people, they had one kind of idea, and then it seemed like it was different when they said elder. When that scholar asked about, elder, what comes to mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. And he's done the one I described is with medical students, but he's done it with tons of different people and people of all ages and backgrounds, and everybody for old, gray and feeble and this, that, and the other, most pretty negative. And then for elder, it's like respect, power, responsibility, influence, wisdom, it's good things. And the interesting thing about that is that if you look up the two words, I'm constantly looking up words, all the more since I read John McPhee's great draft number 4. I used to be a thesaurus person, but he changed me to a dictionary person.
Okay.
So they actually mean the same thing. So everything, negative that we bring to old and all the positives to elder, that's all culture, that's all prejudice. And that's good and bad. It's disappointing because we've done that to ourselves. Like nobody wants to die and nobody wants to grow old. That puts us in a pretty tough spot. On the other hand, things that are cultural can change. And actually you can see that how elders are doing in society has gone up and down throughout history and across cultures.
Mm-hmm. And before you became Dr. Aronson, what what were your ideas of older adults? What would come to mind for you when you were growing up?
Oh, I'm a pretty well-acculturated American, so I didn't think much about it. I was a
Okay.
kid. What did it matter to me? I had a granddad I adored, who was just so much fun, a grandmother who was a little scarier, a great grandmother who seemed like just really, really, really old, ancient to me because she was in her 90s when I was little. So I had a sense that you changed, and also that being in your 90s was different than being in your 60s or 70s. But you just don't think about it. And unlike in school, where I thought I was going to be a pediatrician actually when I went into medicine.
Right.
And you can find tons of classes on kids and ways to volunteer and do things with kids and learn about kids and inspire kids. And there just wasn't as much for older adults. Now, some of that I like because older adults don't need that.
Right.
Many of them are, just like adults. And that's something we don't tend to see. We tend to conflate the frail years with the decades of elderhood. And that actually is problematic. I think what people were talking about when they were using the word old were really the frail years. And does that happen if you don't die suddenly? It does. But we also make that as onerous as it is. Yes, of course, losing functions is difficult. It's disappointing. It can be frustrating. But there are other times in life where we have limitations, like if you're 9 months pregnant, or if you've broken a couple of limbs, or if you're a kid. And we have so many supports, and we don't sort of punish people for needing things from other humans, but we do kind of punish and insult people for growing old.
Do you think that's an interesting point about punishing people for growing old? Do you think there would be much less of a stigma for people as we age if we were a society that offered more support to people in the area of aging? I mean, there's older adults now that have to work. Just some choose because they want to work, but some are, have to work because the cost of living has gone up. I was really surprised by just what you wrote about in your book about just the medical field, and how geriatricians are ranked kind of lower on the
Very
ladder
low.
very low compared to other types of doctors. I was really just shocked about that. And I definitely want to get into that too during the interview. Do you think if we offered more support and better nursing homes and better care, then there wouldn't be this stigma about growing older?
I think some of it's a natural response. So now I'm in my, later mid 50s. I'm not quite sure, but I think I was able to write this book because enough of that stuff had started. For much of my youth, I think I thought I would be sort of 35 until one day I was 75, like boom, which is ridiculous. but when things started to change, I realized I had been ridiculous. And it's just kind of this insidious thing that happens. But when we talk about support, I think we need to think broadly. So So when we think about supports, we often think of supports for people who are frail, and those are absolutely important. And we shouldn't, sort of in healthcare, they'll say older adults use a disproportionate share of healthcare. But we don't hear things such as, which would be their analogies for childhood and adulthood. Children use a grossly disproportional share of education, and education costs this country a fortune. Or adults use a hugely disproportional share of, employment services, or, they're the ones it's the adults who have driven up housing prices, who have created the economic inequality that is just growing by leaps and bounds. And we don't sort of,
yeah, we don't say that.
Should. You hear, yeah, I mean, we do, but we don't blame it on adulthood per se. We do blame it on those people who are doing it. Whereas with old age, you just kind of are blaming people for something that is natural. It's not even what those adults did to lead to the economic crisis we find ourselves in. So it's kind of a double standard. So do I think we could make supports better? Yes. I mean, think of everything for much older people. It's from the clothing to what we call nursing homes. An important fact everyone should know, because everybody thinks like everybody ends up in a nursing home. In the United States, less than 3% of people live in a nursing home. Now, as you move beyond age 80 or 85, your chances go up, maybe 1 in 5. But the vast majority of older adults are just living right with us in our communities.
And what's considered older adult? What age? What's the age range now?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot of debate about that.
Yes.
There was a book, I think, a couple decades ago that said old age is always 10 years older than whatever I am, or something to that effect, which is a very popular definition of old age. A lot of people define it as the period of disability, but that's actually both ableist, which does a huge disservice to everybody who is born with or acquires a disability. And whenever you do prejudice to one group, you are taking down every other group that's open to prejudice, in my view. It also denies a fundamental biological reality. And I think part of how I could discuss this was, being a doctor, I know how the body changes.
Right.
And we know that beginning in the 60s, and actually COVID has shown this really nicely. So if you look at death rates, right, infection rates are mostly in younger people. But if you look at death rates, it starts going up in the 50s, and it goes up more in the 60s, then it doubles in the 70s, and then it just goes off the charts 80 when people are in their 80s and beyond. And that pretty nicely parallels the biological changes that influence our risk for disease, and the benefits and risks of treatment, our likelihood of responding, all sorts of things like that. So there is a biologic reality to old age. There's also the fact that if you go back to ancient Mesopotamia or Persia or Egypt or Greece and Rome or China, you find all the same things. In those days, it was only men, so this is an interesting thing for women's lit, but all the great authors throughout time, you had boy, you had man, and you had old man.
Right.
And that's, 5,000 years of history. So we've always known there were these differences. And I think acknowledging it really helps. But I also think the supports you mentioned about people going back to work, some because they had to and some because they want to.
Yeah.
As we live into advanced old age, through most of human history, most people died in their 30s or early 40s. So we've kind of, come close to doubling the lifespan. That, of course, varies a lot depending on where you live, the color of your skin, and a variety of other things. There's a huge difference between, say, a Native American or Black male and either a white or of East Asian descent female, and depending on where they're living in the country. That spread can be up to 20 years in this country. So
and I imagine to income too as well.
Exactly, yeah. But all those things tie up to income, right? There's so many things that influence each other and accrue over a lifetime. But that's all like sociocultural stuff we could choose to do something about, which we'll see.
That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I know. I was like,
I was just going to say, but we need to support people. Like, people need jobs. When we set the retirement age at 65, which is sort of the legal beginning of elderhood, the average age of death was 67, and now it's in the late 70s or early 80s. So people probably do need to work longer, but we also need to save smarter and create better programs. And people often, people can't get, people in their 70s are the fastest growing entrepreneur segment of the society.
I thought that was wonderful when I heard that.
Well, it's wonderful on the one hand because it's lots of creativity, but the reason for it is actually age bias because nobody will hire them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ageism is everywhere.
It is. Okay, so let's look at ageism within the health industry. I'm going to look at my notes here because when I was reading your book, I was surprised. You said that there's education gaps and training for doctors and health professionals when it comes to treating older adults. And you said clinicians believe that the qualifications for caring for an older adult is caring for an older adult.
Yeah, they literally say that all the time.
I was shocked when you said that. I was shocked also too when I read about how older adults are prescribed medication based on trials of when looking at younger adult bodies too as well. So there's not a lot of trial on prescriptions and medications for older adults. So yeah, all of this was shocking to me. I had no idea that this was happening in the health industry. So what's going on? Are doctors not realizing they're going to be older adults too?
Oh, it's actually funny. I've been leading these continuing education classes, and there are so many former division chiefs that want to join as they've become old. This is particularly true in people who are in social categories, the multiplicity of social categories, which has given them privilege. And if you're like a heterosexual white male, who was really well educated and did really well in his career, being old is the first time you're suddenly being dissed, right? Mm-hmm. So suddenly they want in on my class to learn about old age. Okay. But when they're in power, it's harder to get their attention. Although I feel like I'm making some progress finally. So some of it is historical. Traditionally there weren't so many older people. But actually the distribution of requirements looks now much as it did a century ago, where, women were most likely to die in childbirth, and kids died hugely disproportionately, and most of us didn't live into old age. So we really haven't updated it. They've tweaked it and added things in other ways, but they still don't acknowledge old age. And we just talked about how there are, just tens of thousands of articles documenting biologic and medical differences. But if you take sort of studies, for example, the initial studies were done on, white males between the ages of 25 and 45, let's say. Mm-hmm. And did that breed some really good stuff, and help make heart disease much less prevalent? It did. But back in the day, they would not let women in the studies because, well, women were different than men, and they had all those weird hormone things going on. So they said, well, we're just not going to include them. It messes up with the data. Because in science, you want to control as many variables as you can. So they didn't include the women, but then they would apply the results to the women, and the women would respond differently because they were different, which was actually the assumption from the beginning. So women are often called, said to have atypical chest pain. But it's atypical if you're a man. If you're a woman, it's actually not atypical, but we still call it atypical. Anyway, so the biggest funding agencies in the 1980s realized that if you excluded women and people of color from trials and then applied the results to them, often things didn't go well. So they mandated inclusion. In the 90s, they discovered that kids were also different from adults, so that if you gave the same drug to a person who weighed, 170 pounds and a person who weighed 40 pounds, things don't go so well for the 40-pounder. So that was in the 90s. They did not add old people, a mandate to include old people in trials of diseases, drugs, and procedures that principally affect old people until 2019, last year. It's been not quite a year and a half.
My goodness.
So, the bias is just blatant. And one of the things is that it's kind of a universal thing. Like people who are in other categories where normally they would be separate across racial lines and other age lines and, gender preference lines will all kind of agree like, ooh, that age thing, I don't know about that. Look at our major politicians now and how much time and effort they spend trying to not look their age instead of saying, like Nancy Pelosi saying, this is what 80 looks like, and 80 is running your country and she's female.
Yeah, no, we're definitely,
like if people owned that, it would be much better to grow old. Sorry,
and we're definitely seeing ageism in the election too as well. But let me ask I want to ask you about the upside to aging, but before that, I want to talk about COVID. because definitely we're seeing ageism, with COVID. You wrote about it for the New York Times. Just this rhetoric of like, hey, people are old, they're gonna die. People should sacrifice their lives because they're old, as if like just because you're old, you still don't have quality of life. You still don't have dreams, ambitions. You still don't want to see the next day. What were your thoughts on that when with the age? I think people have even forgotten we're still in a pandemic, but we are. What are your thoughts
So true.
on that? Yeah.
What was really interesting. So my med center has actually done really well with this by and large, but we still had some problems. So at the beginning of March, we had our children's hospital hugely protected, protocols and algorithms for dealing with kids. Well, as we've seen, although the kids can have some bad disease, they get disease in tiny, tiny numbers, and it just doesn't seem to affect them much. And we had a sense of that from China and Italy. So next were adults, and they just weren't including elders. And we also had abundant data from China and more so from Italy, and then very quickly from the United States, that older adults were presenting differently and that their risks for grave disease and death were astronomically higher. And yet nobody was including those different presentations. So a common one in older people, especially in the highest risk group for death, so people over age 75 or 80, is confusion. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control did not add that as one of the presenting symptoms until the third week of May, right? We knew that for almost 3 months before that, or for 3 months if if you're willing to listen to Italians and Chinese doctors who have provided us lots of great data. So we haven't responded appropriately. Then we've got people saying, oh, they're dying anyway. Well, people on hospice might be dying anyway, but other people are actually living. And they have families who love them. And we made all kinds of decisions that made things much worse and discounted lives. There's another really important variable here, which is that, we talked about how disadvantages accrue. So the nursing homes with the most deaths have been the nursing homes with the poorest citizens, and the poorest citizens are disproportionately people with Black and brown skin. So when we hear about COVID disproportionately affects African Americans and COVID disproportionately affects old people, those are actually two circles with a huge amount of overlap, right? If you look at the nursing homes here in the Bay Area that have had trouble, we see that same pattern.
Yeah, there's been some in East Oakland, recently.
And in San Francisco, the facility with the most problems. And these facilities are also problems that have had citations for years. But what you get for a citation is a slap on the wrist. And they're allowed to keep doing business as usual. So many of us are hoping that actually, and think about it for yourself. Are you looking forward to having to move into a nursing home one day? I've actually rarely, I should let you answer that.
I was going to say, if it was like college dorm life, then I
exactly.
then I'll be, or if it's like the Golden Girls.
Right. And there are some that are like that. So there's one in San Francisco, and when it opened, you had to put $1 million down, and you still paid about $10,000 a month.
Okay.
So most of us are not going to be living there.
Yeah, I haven't made that kind of money yet.
Yeah. So but we could decide as a society to do this much better. It would also create a lot of jobs, right? Yeah. Jobs, design jobs. I think I forgot to continue later about, clothing or homes. Like, it's hard to age in place because we make like cute, fun, colorful things for kids, and we make all sorts of stylish stuff for, adults to wear or to put in their homes. And then what do we do as people get older? It's so ugly. It's just ugly. And it doesn't have to be that way. There is a huge market now. Baby boomers are into their 70s.
And they want to look cute.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
People do.
Boomers want to look cute.
So, if you're in home design, if you're in architecture, if you're in clothing design, if you're in grooming, if you're in, health, if you're in education, if you're in jobs, if you're in so many sectors, transportation, there are so many potential jobs. And with our economy tanking, this is something to start thinking about. This is a way to simultaneously get people employed while making a world we can all look forward to age in.
So I want to talk about, because I know we're going to get questions pretty soon. And I know often the discussion about aging is kind of the heavy stuff, the discrimination, the ageism, your body changing. But there are people like yourself who said you look forward to aging, and you appreciate the aging process, if you will. What is the upside to aging?
Well, there's this wonderful thing called the U-shaped curve of happiness, which
yes,
is,
I've seen it.
I know, isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
And nobody knows, like, it's crazy, but people are fairly happy as kids, and then it bottoms out in adulthood, like 40s and 50s, pretty heavy, stressful times. And then in your late 50s, things start improving. In your 60s, they get a lot better, and it goes on up from there.
Yeah.
Now, this is not in every single country. So if you look at the poorest countries in Asia or in Africa or in Latin America, if you're really impoverished and an average death rate is like in the 40s or something, you don't see that there.
Right.
But for most countries, you do see it. For the United States, you do see it. And you see it across, geographic and other lines. Why is this? Well, part of it is that I think there's a certain release to the invisibility or to the physical changes. It's not that people don't try and look good, but there's less pressure because you're kind of like automatically off the, like, I don't know, but there anything like where people stand when they win Miss America or whatever. Yeah. Like, you're just not in that context.
Right.
More, so you could still look good, but the pressures are a little different. There is just a comfort with self. And the ticking clock is a favor. So anybody who writes or reads enough books knows that we writers use the clock to create tension, to create focus, right? To help prioritize. And it's kind of knowing that more is behind you than ahead of you.
Right.
Better decisions. I can see that already in my career. There used to be things I would do out of sheer ambition or flattery. And now I'm like, no, like, things start happening to people in their 50s. I've got limited time. I'm going to do the things that I really believe in, that are going to make a difference in the world, and that I'm going to enjoy doing. And luckily, I'm a person who has the opportunity to do it that way.
Yeah.
But even people with fewer opportunities are just clearer on what matters.
Yeah.
I'm going to spend more time with family. I'm going to walk outside every day. This is pre-COVID, obviously. Although interestingly, just yesterday in the Journal of the American Medical Society was a paper on the psychological impact of COVID on people. And they showed the highest impact was negative impact was on people in their 20s. Next highest or sort of middle was people ages, I think they did 30 to 55. And then the least impacted in terms of their happiness and quality of life was people over age 55. Now, they weren't obviously surveying the people who are locked up in assisted living and nursing home facilities, although hopefully we're going to working hard with the San Francisco Department of Public Health to get those people out, and soon, because everyone needs fresh air and human contact.
Right. And I think, so I'm thinking about my grandmother. I have one grandmother that is still living. I have grandparents in San Diego, a step grandmother, my grandfather. They're very active. They're in their 70s and 80s. And I'm thinking about my grandmother that passed away. I notice sometimes with aging, people, the filter, the filter has gotten thinner.
Yes. It just, you're like, I'm me, take it or leave it.
Right. And I was like, I think that's a perk too, because I've noticed some of the elders in my family are like, look, I've seen it, especially my grandmother that's passed away. I would say, wow, like I would be shocked about something. And she'd say, honey, keep living. Keep living.
I love it. That's just what I'm talking about. It's just like was comfortable with who she was, and this is it.
Yeah. No, she absolutely was. And something else I want to talk about too that you mentioned in your book is I brought it up here, but I have a makeup bag that my grandmother, and I actually wrote an article about this for KQED. My grandmother, I was helping her with some things, and I found her makeup bag, and it had sexy on it. This is my grandmother, 80. And I was like, I looked at her, I called her Bama. I was like, Bama, is this yours? And she snatched it, she was like, mind your business. But, elders are still sexually active, and they still have sexual feelings.
Absolutely.
And people don't recognize that and realize that.
Well, and some people are made to feel ashamed about that, which there's no shame to it. I mean, I think my biggest message is that when you're old, you're still a human being with everything that entails, good things and bad things. The good things and bad things are a little different, but they're still all there. The number one reason older people don't have sex is that they no longer have a partner. It's not that they don't want to have sex or they can't enjoy sex. And is having sex different? Yes. You know, the way you do things is different as you grow older. But this is another prejudice that we've been discussing. And actually, I was working on. We now have a course for the medical students in September, and I was looking over it for one of my colleagues yesterday, and we put sex right in there because it, in the case we go over with them, the primary care clinician had never asked this 86-year-old about his sexual activity, and he gets a sexually transmitted infection. Because older adults also tend to think they're beyond that. Well, if they have a same age partner, they can not worry about pregnancy, but that doesn't mean you're not at risk for STIs.
Yeah, no, I've had this conversation with some elders who are now widows. So yeah.
Well, and sexy is true. Like the general public may not see sexy, but as I've gotten older, what I consider sexy has absolutely changed. And it's gotten older. And it's not like I don't look at beautiful young people and think, wow, he or she is gorgeous.
Yeah.
But it's just that when I look at certain older people, I think that is really sexy.
Yeah.
In a way that I would not have seen 20 years ago.
So we have some questions that people are eager to ask. And so I'm going to ask Sherilyn to bring those in.
Yes, this is a great conversation. Thank you.
Yes.
So yeah, one in the Q&A box and a bunch that have come to me privately. So Sandy asks, I wonder about your thoughts about the issue of the huge population of elder adults relying on the payroll deductions of younger adults to fund the safety net for elders via Medicare, Social Security, and the attended intergenerational resentment.
Ooh, such a good question. It is, it was set up when there were a lot more younger people and a lot fewer elders. So it puts some burden. I think we have to have a safety net for all different sorts of people. And again, as I said, in reference to something else earlier, once you start carving away at safety nets or start diminishing people for one of their basic human needs, it's a slippery slope, and eventually all of us are gonna fall out there. So I think we need a safety net. It might be that the systems that were set up in the first half of the last century are not the optimal systems for right now. We have more billionaires and more bazillionaire, I don't even know the language for this, corporations. It's sort of the gazillionaire invention. But anyway, it's hard to believe that any human being really needs that kind of money. And it seems like we could do something that would help us get back to more of the bell-shaped curve of economic status that we had when I was a kid. It used to be that they would teach us that part of why we were such a great democracy is that there were some really rich people and there were some very poor people, but most of us were somewhere in between, and obviously the in-between had a big spread. And now we're not that country. We're a country with, a smaller number, but an incredible number actually of rich and very rich people. And then a whole lot and growing every day numbers of poor people. And so I think what we need to do is say, yes, we believe in safety net. Yes, we believe in, supporting each other because all of us will need this at some point. And the people who tend to need it more are either have suffered grave, misfortunes of no fault of their own, or have been subject to our structural inequities for generations. So we need to do that. We may just need to do it in a different way than was set up in the last century.
Mm-hmm. Can I do a follow-up, Jeneé, to that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah. We had a couple of questions on, and I don't know, Louise, if you want to just sort of give your verdict on, the various proposals for healthcare reform. But there is some curiosity about what you think, Medicare for all or moderated system, et cetera.
Well, I definitely think we need healthcare for all, and people say that's socialist. Well, we have public education for all. If you call the police and fire in most places, they come for all. The streets are kept for all. If you're going to go down that route, we're going to have to get rid of a whole lot of other things that people take for granted. Is Medicare for all the best approach? I'm not sure about that. Medicare has its flaws. I think it would have to come with some serious Medicare reform for a couple of reasons. One is Medicare doesn't always make wise decisions. For example, for older people, it will pay for months of treatments of very little benefit and a great deal of torture to an older person, such as intensive care unit therapy when all organs aren't functioning and the person isn't going to get better. And if they're going to get better, they're going to be in a facility and maintained on machines. They'll pay for that, but they won't pay for a hearing aid. And not being able to hear leads to depression and cognitive dysfunction and social isolation, and increases your risk of adverse health events by 17-fold. So I would want to see some Medicare reforms. I would also want to make sure that Medicare still paid attention to older adults and their unique needs to make sure that happened. I think anything that would cover all the uninsured people would be progress. And that, as we saw globally, what worked in different countries was radically different. And what worked, say, initially in Britain isn't working particularly well now. So we can't just put a system into place, say this is a great system, and expect it to work in perpetuity, right? Add the electronic health record, add the numbers of new diseases and treatments that have been developed since the NHS, and you have a system that isn't functioning very well. Some others, like the German system, have worked better. But I think we need to realize that all health systems need to be revised pretty regularly because of the pace of science and technological change. And that all countries with better health than ours, we are currently ranked 37th globally for our health outcomes, do much more for equity. They cover all citizens for health, and they emphasize primary care a whole lot more. What we do is we really focus on the intensive care that everybody hopes not to have to need. And if we had a system that was properly weighted, far fewer of us would need that very high cost care. And that would enable us to afford the primary care that comes much less expensively.
Wow, 37. We're
Yeah.
37.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, no, people don't know, but yeah, that's not good. We act like we're, the cat's meow, and we are on the tech sector. But we're not so good at keeping people out of the hospital. And actually, you can have the exact same training, and if you work in a hospital, you'll get paid more. You get compensated more for the care of the patient in the hospital. All the fiscal incentives point towards letting people get sick enough that they require a hospital stay and hopefully a procedure.
Sherilyn, you have more questions?
Yeah, sure. So if we could follow up, what advice would you have then for someone caring for or finding care for an older relative? How can we support our friends and families through this time in their lives?
Okay, I love that question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually working on a program that hopefully will help us all do this better. But I think a couple of things there. One is always good to be an ally. And the other is the old person themselves may also be discounting all that they can do. So we can, yes, with age, there are declines in physical function, but you can reverse and delay huge numbers of things that we consider just part and parcel of old age. There's really good data on this, but most doctors don't know it. Most physical therapists don't know it. And does it take longer? When I was younger and would be on call for a few nights and never sleep, I could still run more easily than I can now if I take a few days off. So does age matter? It absolutely does. But people can make huge strides in what they're able to do with some effort. We also tend to undervalue what changes to the physical environment, to the home, can do to allow a person to age well and successfully in place. One of the great boons of COVID has been more and more older people getting online. Some people can't afford it or can't afford the internet connection, so the digital divide remains. But of people who had and could afford devices, more of them are getting on, and we're coming up with more programs to help them get on, because, what do we do when we're stuck? We can order things to be dropped off. We can, connect with each other digitally. And now I think older adults who said, that ship sailed for me, are deciding like, no, actually I need this in my life now. So that's progress. I think starting by asking, what is it you want to the older person, and what can I do to support you, rather than swooping in. Remembering not to use elder speak, so sort of talking down to people. Remembering that younger supporters of older people tend to put safety first, and older people tend to put quality of life first, just like younger people. That's another one of those human things that doesn't change across the lifespan. And I think as people reach advanced old age, we have to consider different trade-offs. There are people now who know that their remaining lifespan is months to years. And a good number of them say, I'd rather be living my life and risk dying of COVID. And I wouldn't take a ventilator or any of that, because I know it wouldn't go well for me, but I'd want you to make me comfortable. But I'd rather live because I'm missing out on my life now. So I think really putting it in the age stage perspective, and that's going to differ hugely, whether a person's in their 60s or 90s, but also what their health status is in their 60s and 90s. Some communities have a lot of what we call accelerated aging, and other very fortunate people, like many of the people running the country, are thriving, into their 80s. So there's variety, and we have to individualize. But I think really asking and working as a partner, and not doing for, but doing with, is a really good approach.
I've been a part-time caretaker. My grandmother who passed away, I mentioned she had dementia. So shout out to all the caretakers. I know it's not an easy job. And there are older adults who are also caretakers too, as well.
A huge percentage.
Yeah. And then another thing I know you mentioned about, with COVID, and one thing we've seen too is people actually communicating, I think, probably more with elders because they're at home. And like you said, there's the digital divide. And so people are, I noticed, making more phone calls. So yeah, I just want to mention that. And I think we have one more question.
Yeah. Let me introduce myself. Okay. Where did it go? Yes, wanted to ask a question about your burnout that you talk about in the book. If you can tell us about your experience of burnout, why it arose, and especially how you got out of it, with advice to our listeners, because a lot of people face burnout.
Right. Yeah. It's over half of physicians, but it's really common in many professions. I think it's our accelerated all the time, demanding society. And actually, I heard something on the radio, and I'm afraid I'm not going to attribute it well enough, but it was something on NPR a few months ago about how technology doesn't necessarily lessen our burdens, it changes them. So they were talking about how what's happening now is very much like what happened with kitchen aids in the 50s. They said, women are going to be liberated because, they're going to have dishwashers and ovens and all these things. And then they got those, and their work hours remained at 60 for the average housewife, 60 per week. And that was because expectations changed. You had to make better dinners because you had all this help, et cetera, et cetera. So I sort of feel like that's what happened in medicine. We got an electronic medical record, and there are some huge advantages to that. Like, you don't have to worry about reading certain people's handwriting, which was really hard sometimes. There are jokes about doctors' handwriting for very good reason. And I can see sometimes, not always, I actually have two people I'm seeing this afternoon where I can't get their records, but often I can see people's care at other facilities. And I can see it if it's in the hospital and my clinic building is somewhere else. So all of that is really good. But the electronic record has also made us much less efficient, and it's given us less time to interact with patients. So part of the burnout is that we spend a huge amount of time tending the computer and much less time with patients. And most of us went into medicine because we like taking care of patients, because we're interested in patient care, not computer care. And the early programs, actually the most commonly used program nationwide, was developed for billing. So it actually doesn't care about either the clinician or the patient. And that's been part of the problem. Health systems have just bought this on. So then that also makes you feel like your health system doesn't care. And when ours converted us over, they gave us a little time for inefficiency. And then they noted that We just weren't getting back to normal, but they ramped up everybody's schedules. So you basically on a daily basis were forced to choose between having any time at all with your family or ever exercising and maintaining your own health, or doing the right thing by your patients. For those of us who do mostly outpatient or primary care, as I was just saying, all the pressures are towards inpatient care, and people do shifts, and we're constantly on, and there isn't good coverage, and there aren't good protections, and there isn't enough support. And that has to do with financing and time allowances. Actually, for one of my patients this afternoon too, I was looking at, he had just seen his new primary care doctor, and she wrote this note where she really gave him like a significant diagnosis of dementia that he does not have. And I think she did that because he had an episode of confusion. This is an acute state caused by a medication, also hearkening back to something we discussed earlier, and that is transient, and he's fine. So now that diagnosis will be carried forward. And she got a couple things wrong, and then I looked and she had 20 minutes to deal with this patient who is 90 years old and has an extensive medical history, and to review that history, and to see the patient, and to write this note in the chart where you have to click all these boxes. So, when you want to do the right thing and the system really doesn't let you, you experience what's called moral distress. And moral distress leads to burnout. And that's what's happened to so much of us, so many of us. And I also think the systems and the people who are part of the systems, many of whom I've known for decades, they take on these positions and they stop seeing what it's like for the people on the ground. And I have a junior colleague who came to me earlier this week, and she says, they're blaming me, but here's the problem. I wasn't covered when I was on inpatient, and this man died, and nobody had called his wife back. And you see this too often. These are structural issues. These are not issues of human weakness. For me, I got out of it by taking a leave and reprioritizing my whole life and switching clinical situations. And just being stronger now about what I'm willing to do and what I'm willing to put up with. And I also pad my clinic time. I took a decrease in pay, and I have given myself enough time to do right by my patients. That doesn't always work. I have the writing job, and now I have the public health job. So it's still a lot, but I don't pretend I'm going to be able to do it in the time they give me, and that I schedule it accordingly. And that sort of helps me do the right thing, which helps me live with myself, which keeps me from getting burned out again.
We have just a few minutes, and I know, because I know you are working. You're on the clock right now.
Yes, I got a patient at 1.
You got a patient at 1. So, last question before we wrap up, and thank you for explaining that burnout too as well. I learned so much just from that explanation you just gave, and I know that's also in your book too as well. Real quick, what hope do you have about how we perceive aging? How that's changing. What are you seeing now that gives you hope?
Well, I think the boomers are already making noise, and that is a good thing, because the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? Like, it's a cliche for a reason. And there have been other civil rights movements that have, made progress. Nothing is perfect yet, as we all too well know. But if you don't stand up for yourself, you're invisible. And when you're invisible, no one cares, because they're busy dealing with the people who are shouting. And we had the Great Generation, and the Great Generation was great in part because they just took it. Like, you could not get those people to complain of pain, even when you could see they were in pain. We would have to use euphemisms like, you'd see somebody with a terrible cancer, you'd see them grimacing and having trouble moving. You'd say, "Are you in pain?" "Oh, no, not really. Not so bad." Or something like that. And you say, "Well, you have any discomfort when you move?" "Oh, yeah, maybe." We'd use euphemisms. Then came the silent generation. Well, that says it all, right? But boomers aren't going to take that. And I hope what everybody will do, and older generations too, because this doesn't have to be left to the boomers, but every human being has human rights. Stand up for your human rights. Just because you've lived a long time doesn't mean you don't have human rights any longer. And it's okay to ask for what you need. We all need things throughout our whole lives. And we cannot have, certainly the health system, which is what contributed, health and public medicine and public health gave us these long lives. And now they have abdicated their responsibility for helping us thrive and be comfortable in those advanced years. So we can all speak up all the time. And as I said, across sectors, because really, if people are talking about kids and adults, you need to say, and what about elders? If they're talking about childhood and adulthood, you need to say, and what about elderhood? Because otherwise you're just being discriminatory, and we're setting ourselves up for the old age that scares everyone, instead of setting ourselves up for an old age we can look forward to. And when you actually look around, more people are thriving than not. And imagine if we had a world that didn't have so much bias, how well we could do. And we could also look forward to it and not have such silly debates about when old is. Because, let's face it, we all know old when we see it. You can say you're an older adult, but at some point, if we're lucky, we all will be straight up old. And that needs to be okay.
Well, everyone, I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you so much, Dr. Aronson. This is her book, Elderhood. Make sure you get it. If you would like a copy, there will be a link at the end of this program that you can follow to purchase, and that you can purchase from one of our independent bookstores. Thank you so much again. Get this book.
Well, thanks, Jeneé, for such a good conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I have a whole list of questions. So that's why I said there's so much information here. Make sure you get this book. Again, my name is Jeneé Darden, and you have been watching Women Lit Unbound. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Congratulations.